400 tents. That is the number you need to remember. Not 400,000, just 400. In the grand, bloody ledger of history, that is a rounding error, a statistical insignificance. Yet from these 400 tents of black goat hair, stitched together by the trembling hands of refugees, an entity would rise to swallow 3 continents. It would devour the Balkans, drink the Tigris dry, and hammer at the gates of Vienna. But we are not here to talk about the golden age of the Ottoman Empire. We are here to talk about the price of admission. Because empires are not built on treaties. They are built on what the early Turks called kilit hakkı, the right of the sword. To understand this rise, you must first purge your mind of the romanticized paintings of noble sultans sitting on velvet cushions. Instead, I want you to visualize a different image, a darker image. Picture the daughter of a Byzantine Tekfur, a local governor. In the morning, she is draped in purple silk, safe behind the stone walls of a border fortress. By sunset, the walls are breached. The silk is torn away. She is no longer a person. She is no longer royalty. She is now inventory. She is stripped, inspected, and chained in a line with 100 others, destined for the slave markets of Cairo or the bed of a rough warlord. This was the currency of the frontier. This was the primal truth hidden behind the history books. The initial capital for this global superpower was not gold. It was human flesh. It was the ability to look at a neighbor, destroy his home, and turn his family into liquid assets. This is not a story of divine intervention. It is a story of survival at its most savage. But before there were slaves to sell, there was only the cold. The biting, relentless wind of the Bithynian highlands in the year 1299. If you were to stand there today, closing your eyes against the gale, you might still hear the ghosts of the Kai tribe. They were not conquerors yet. They were prey. Let us descend from the high view of history down to the mud. It is night. The air is thick, with the smell of burning sheep fat, the only fuel available to keep the darkness at bay. It sticks to your throat. It smells of desperation. The ground beneath your feet is hard, frozen by the Anatolian winter. Inside one of those black tents, men are huddled together, not out of camaraderie, but out of necessity for warmth. Their armor is not the gleaming steel of later centuries. It is leather, hardened and cracked, reinforced with scraps of iron scavenged from the dead.
To the east, the Mongol hordes are burning the world, a storm of destruction that has pushed these people to the very edge of the map. To the west, the decaying carcass of the Byzantine Empire watches them with weary, hostile eyes. They are trapped between a hammer and an anvil. And in the center of this trap sits a man. He is not wearing a crown. He is wearing a simple turban, perhaps stained with the dust of the road. His hands are rough, calloused from the reins of his horse, not manicured for holding a scepter. He eats from a wooden bowl, sharing the same fire as his lowest soldier. His name is Osman. And he is staring into the embers of the fire, realizing that he has a choice to make. He can continue to run and let his people fade into the footnotes of history like 1,000 tribes before them. Or he can turn around, draw his curved blade, and carve a bloody path into the future. The rise of the Ottoman Empire did not begin with a fanfare of trumpets. It began here, in the cold, with the smell of burning fat and the realization that in this world, you are either the butcher or the cattle. In a world divided into predators and prey,
the man who would tip the scales sat quietly in the shadows. He did not look like the founder of a dynasty that would one day rule the Mediterranean. If you were a walk past him in the camp that night, you might have mistaken him for a common sentry, or perhaps a weary shepherd tending to a dying fire. There was no golden throne beneath him. There was only a rough rug woven with the geometric patterns of the Kayi tribe, laid out on the cold, hard earth. This is Osman. Not Osman the Magnificent, not Osman the Sultan, just Osman, the Bey, the chieftain of a ragged band of nomads. History often tries to dress its heroes in finery before the story even begins. But to understand the rise of the Ottoman Empire, we must look at the poverty of its architect. We must look at what he owned, or rather, what he did not own. Decades later, when he would finally succumb to old age and death, his personal treasury would be opened. Do you know what they found? They did not find chests of Byzantine gold. They did not find jewels looted from the palaces of Nicaea. They found a simple cotton caftan, a salt shaker, a wooden box for holding spoons, and a pair of worn-out boots. That was it. That was the net worth of the man who broke the Byzantine frontier. Why? Was he a poor manager of money? No. He was a genius of a different kind of economy. Osman understood something that the bloated governors in their castles had forgotten. Loyalty is expensive, and it cannot be bought with promises. He gave away every piece of gold, every silk bolt, every captured sheep to his followers. He kept nothing for himself, but the respect of the men who bled for him. He sat with them, dipped his wooden spoon into the same pot of bulgur and lamb fat, and slept under the same leaking tents. In the brutal meritocracy of the steppe, a leader did not eat until his wolves were fed. This radical humility was his greatest weapon. It turned mercenaries into disciples. It turned a raiding party into a brotherhood. Look closely at him now, illuminated by the flickering orange light. Resting against his knee is a weapon that looks deceptively simple. It is a composite bow, shorter than the English longbow, but far more lethal in the hands of a horseman. It is a masterpiece of engineering, constructed from layers of maple wood, animal horn, and sinew, glued together with fish bladder. When drawn, it snaps with the force of a thunderclap, capable of punching an arrow through chainmail at 300 paces. It is unstrung now, resting like a coiled snake, but it is never out of reach. And on his head, he wears the turban. To the modern eye, it is just headgear, but to the Ghazi warrior of the 13th century, it was a statement of intent. The white cloth wound around his helmet was not for fashion. It was his Kefen, his burial shroud. By wearing it into battle, he was signaling to God and his enemies that he was already dead. He had accepted his mortality before the first arrow was loosed. He was walking around, carrying his own grave on his head. This is the psychology of the men we are dealing with. How do you fight a man who has already dressed himself for his funeral? How do you intimidate an army that considers death a promotion? Osman stirs the fire, sending sparks drifting up into the black void above. The silence in the camp is heavy, filled with the unspoken tension of men who know that tomorrow might bring their end. They are waiting for a sign. They are waiting for a direction. The Seljuk Sultanate, their nominal overlord, is crumbling, rotting from the inside out, consumed by court intrigue and Mongol tribute demands. The Byzantine Empire is a senile giant, blind and flailing. In this vacuum of power, Osman feels the weight of the sword at his hip. It is a heavy, curved blade, forged for slashing from horseback. It is cold to the touch. He knows that the time for hiding in the hills is over. The wolves are hungry, and he is the only one who knows where the meat is. The meat was not hard to find. It was rotting right in front of them. To truly understand the rise of the Ottoman Empire, we must stop looking at Osman for a moment and look at the worlds that created him. He did not emerge in a vacuum. He emerged in a graveyard of empires. To his east lay the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, his own overlords. Once, they had been the terror of the steppes, the lions of Islam. But now, they were a dying father, coughing up blood, their spines shattered by the Mongol invasions. They were weak, fractured, and demanding taxes they had no power to collect. To his west lay the Byzantine Empire, the direct descendant of ancient Rome. For 1,000 years, they had been the guardians of Christendom, the masters of gold and stone. But by 1299, the eagle of Rome was old. It was blind. Its claws were dull. The governors in the borderlands were corrupt, selling their own defenses to line their pockets, hiring mercenaries they couldn't pay, and taxing their peasants into starvation. Osman stood exactly on the fault line between these two crumbling giants. This unique geography was his destiny. Other Turkish beys were trapped deep in the interior, fighting each other over scraps of arid land. But Osman, he had the frontier advantage. He had the only thing that mattered in a holy war, a border with the infidel. Every morning he could look out from his tent and see the lands of the Romans, rich, vulnerable, and ripe for the taking. This turned his small tribe into a magnet. If you were a bandit running from the law, you went to Osman. If you were a religious zealot seeking martyrdom, you went to Osman. If you were a refugee starving to death, you went to Osman. He became the funnel for all the restless, violent energy of the region. But this brings us to the uncomfortable question, the silence that sits at the heart of this story. History books written by the victors will tell you that this was a divine mission. They will tell you that Osman was a Ghazi, a holy warrior driven by pure faith to expand the domain of Islam. They paint him in hues of pious white and spiritual green. But look closer at the records. Look at the alliances he made with Christian renegades. Look at how he fought Muslim rivals with the same ferocity he used against the Byzantines. Look at how the plunder was distributed. So, before we ride further into the smoke of Bithynia, I need you to make a judgment. I need you to strip away 600 years of imperial propaganda and look at the man standing in the mud. Who is Osman? Is he the holy warrior, the chosen instrument of God, destined to bring order to chaos and build a civilization that would light up the world? Or is he simply a border warlord, a cunning gang leader who realized that religion was the best recruitment tool and that the easiest way to build a kingdom was to rob the dying man next door? The drums of the Nevbet are beating, slow, heavy, like a judge's gavel hitting the table. Tongue, tongue. The verdict is yours to make, but be warned. In the story that follows, the line between saint and sinner is drawn in blood. Whatever verdict you choose, saint or sinner, it ultimately does not matter to the dead. And in 13th century Anatolia, there were a lot of dead. To understand the rise of the Ottoman Empire, we must first understand the stage upon which this tragedy was performed. It was not a land of milk and honey. It was a land of scorched earth and blood. Picture a map of modern Turkey. Now, take a knife and shred it. burn the edges. That is Anatolia in 1299. It was the medieval equivalent of a post-apocalyptic wasteland. There was no law. There was no emperor whose writ ran further than the range of an arrow flight. The old world order, the Pax Romana of the Byzantines and the Pax Seljuk of the Turks, had collapsed simultaneously, leaving behind a terrifying vacuum. In the east, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, once the glorious patrons of art and architecture, had been reduced to a vassal state. They were broken. In 1243, at the Battle of Kuzida, the Mongol war machine had rolled over them like a tidal wave of iron. The Mongols did not just defeat armies, they broke the psychological spine of the region. They turned sultans into tax collectors and cities into smoking ruins. The fear of the Mongols was so absolute that it pushed waves of refugees, Turkomans, mystics, dervishes, and soldiers westward, compressing them into the narrow strip of land where Osman camped. It was a pressure cooker. Too many men, too many swords, and not enough land to feed them all. This compression created a landscape of total anarchy. The central government had vanished. In its place rose the beyliks, petty principalities run by local warlords. It was a war of all against all. Germianids fighting Karamanids, Kandarids fighting Saruhanids, brother fighting brother for a hill, a stream, a flock of sheep. It was a time when you slept with one eye open and a dagger in your hand. If you were a peasant, it didn't matter who claimed to be king. Your reality was the dust cloud on the horizon. If the cloud was small, it was a raiding party. If the cloud was large, it was an army. Either way, you were likely going to die. The land itself bore the scars of this endless conflict. The sophisticated irrigation systems of the Romans were smashed. The trade routes were infested with bandits. The great cities were retreating behind their walls, leaving the countryside to the wolves and the weeds. There is a chilling Turkish proverb from this era that sums up the desolation. Where the horse of the Turk steps, no grass grows. It wasn't an insult. It was a description of reality. The nomadic lifestyle required vast pastures, and the constant movement of armies turned fertile fields into dust bowls. Yet, in this chaos, Osman found his opportunity. While the other Turkish beys were busy fighting each other in the interior, tearing at the carcass of the Seljuk state, Osman was pushed to the very edge. The Uj, the frontier, the marches. He was in the worst possible real estate, right up against the hostile Byzantine border. It was the dangerous neighborhood. But this danger was his salvation. Because he was on the border, he didn't have to fight his Muslim brothers for land. He could fight the infidel. This gave him a moral high ground that the other warlords lacked. It attracted the Ghazis, the freelance warriors of the faith. They didn't want to fight for a bey who was killing other Muslims. They wanted to fight for the man who was expanding the House of Islam. Osman's camp became a beacon in the dark. It was the only place where the mission was clear. In a world of confusing, fratricidal violence, he offered a simple binary. Us against them. The crescent against the cross. This clarity was intoxicating. It drew men to him like moths to a flame. They came riding out of the dust of the anarchic East, tough, hardened survivors who had lost everything to the Mongols and had nothing left to lose. They looked at the chaos behind them, and then they looked at Osman, pointing his sword west toward the setting sun and the gold of Byzantium. And they made their choice. They would follow this simple tribal leader into the fire, not because he was a king, but because in a land of chaos, he was the only one who offered a path forward. If Osman was the hungry wolf circling the fold, then we must now look at the sheep. But these were no ordinary sheep. They were dressed in purple silk and drank from goblets of gold. They lived behind triple-layered walls of stone that had stood for centuries. To the uneducated eye of a nomad, the Byzantine frontier fortresses looked impregnable. They looked like the jagged teeth of a god, jutting out of the earth to defy the sky. But Osman saw something else. He saw the cracks in the mortar. He saw the rot behind the stone. The men holding these fortresses were known as Tekfurs. In theory, they were governors appointed by the emperor in Constantinople. In reality, they were petty kings, isolated warlords ruling over their own little fiefdoms of misery. The centralized power of the empire had receded like a tide, leaving these men stranded on the rocks of the borderlands. And like any creature cut off from the head, they had gone mad with greed. They were no longer Romans protecting the realm. They were parasites sucking the blood of their own peasantry. To understand why the Ottomans rose so fast, you have to understand the suicide of the Byzantine defense. For generations, the border had been guarded by the Akritai, local militia, tough frontiersmen who were given tax breaks and land in exchange for holding the line against the Turks. They were the shield of the empire. But the bureaucrats in Constantinople, in their infinite arrogance and short-sightedness, decided to save money. They dissolved the Akritai. They took away their tax breaks. They seized their land. They turned their own defenders into beggars. Can you imagine the catastrophic stupidity of this? The emperor effectively fired the only men who knew how to fight the Turks. The result was a vacuum of loyalty. When Osman rode up to a village, the locals didn't see him as a monster coming to destroy them. They saw him as an alternative to the tax collectors from Constantinople, who had already stripped them bare. In many cases, the Byzantine peasants opened the gates. They preferred the barbarian, who asked for a tithe, to the civilized governor who took everything. Inside the castles, the Tekfurs lived in a delusion. Let us paint the picture of their final days. While the countryside burned, they held banquets. They wore brocade robes stiff with gold thread, imported from Venice, while their soldiers went unpaid. They hired mercenaries, Catalans, Alans, heavy cavalry from the west, to fight for them. But mercenaries are loyal only to the coin, and the Tekfurs were bankrupt. Often, these hired guns would turn around and sack the very castles they were paid to protect, or worse, they would defect to Osman. Why fight for a bankrupt Christian lord when the pagan Turk pays in immediate plunder? The Tekfur looked down from his high tower and saw the tents of the Kai tribe multiplying like mushrooms after rain. He sneered. He called them dog-eaters and savages. He trusted in his walls. He did not understand that walls are useless if the men standing on them have empty stomachs and hearts full of resentment. He did not understand that his authority was a hollow shell, held together by inertia and fear. Osman did not just conquer these lands. He walked into a house that was already falling down. He pushed against a door that had been unlocked by the greed of the very people guarding it. The Byzantine Empire was not murdered. It died of neglect. It died because it forgot that a state that eats its own people will eventually have no one left to feed to the wolves. While the Tekfurs in their high towers relied on paid mercenaries who would switch sides for a handful of silver, Osman relied on something far more potent. He tapped into a force that burns hotter than greed and lasts longer than fear. He weaponized faith. To understand the engine that drove this conquest, you must understand the word that was whispered in every tent, carved into every saddle, and shouted before every charge. Ghazi. Today, this word is a sterile historical term, but in 1299, it was a drug. It was an identity. A Ghazi was not a soldier. A soldier fights because he is ordered to. A Ghazi fights because he is hungry. Hungry for the spoils of this world and the glory of the next. It was the perfect psychological cocktail. If you survived the battle, you got rich. If you died, you went to paradise. There was no losing scenario. Walk with me through the camp at dusk. The cooking fires are dying down. The air should be silent, but it is not. It is vibrating. A low, rhythmic humming rises from the circles of men. They are not sharpening swords. They are sharpening their souls. This is the influence of the Akis, the brotherhoods of craftsmen and mystics who formed the backbone of early Ottoman society. These were not orthodox theologians debating scripture in a madrasa. These were rough men, tanners and blacksmiths, who practiced a mystical, trance-like form of Islam. They are performing the zikr. They rock back and forth, chanting the names of God until their eyes roll back, until the fear of death is scrubbed from their minds, replaced by a cold, burning ecstasy. Who, who, who. The sound is not loud, but it is relentless. It mimics the heartbeat. It creates a collective consciousness where the individual vanishes and only the group remains. In this state, a man stops being a shepherd or a father. He becomes an instrument of divine will. He believes that the sword in his hand is not guided by his own muscles, but by the hand of the Almighty. This is terrifying to fight against. How do you break the morale of an enemy who believes that your arrows are gifts from God, rushing him faster to his reward? But do not mistake this for pure, unadulterated piety. We must be honest about the darker side of the Ghazi ethos. There was a very practical, very bloody incentive driving these holy warriors. Ghanima, war booty. In the strict interpretation of the frontier law, the property of the infidel was halal, lawful for the taking. The women, the children, the cattle, the grain, it was all waiting to be liberated. Osman was a master of balancing these two scales. He stood at the intersection of the mosque and the market. He knew that men could not eat prayers, so he promised them a double reward. He told them, "Come with me. We will break the Byzantine line. You will serve God by expanding the Dar al-Islam, House of Islam. And in return, God will provide for you from the granaries of the Romans." It was a sanctified heist. It elevated banditry to the level of a sacrament. This dual motivation created a new breed of warrior. The Ghazi was a hybrid monster, half monk, half wolf. He carried a string of prayer beads in one hand and a lasso for capturing slaves in the other. He would weep with religious fervor at the recitation of a poem, and an hour later, he would burn a village to the ground without a flicker of remorse. This moral flexibility was their armor. It allowed them to commit unspeakable acts of violence without the burden of guilt. In their eyes, the burning village was not a tragedy. It was a purification. The screaming captives were not victims. They were the inevitable yield of the harvest. Osman did not just give these men a target. He gave them absolution. But absolution requires a priest, and a king requires a crown. Osman had the sword, but he lacked the legitimacy. In the chaotic world of 13th century Anatolia, raw power was cheap. Any bandit with 100 horsemen could call himself a bey. To become a sultan, to build something that would last longer than a single lifetime, Osman needed something more than steel. He needed a spiritual sanction. He needed a connection to the divine. Enter Sheikh Edebali. If Osman was the iron hand of the state, Edebali was its guiding soul. He was not a warrior. He was an ahi, a leader of the mystical brotherhoods that controlled the trade guilds and the spiritual life of the frontier. Imagine a man whose authority did not come from shouting commands, but from whispering them. He lived in a modest lodge, a tekke, filled with the scent of dried sage and old parchment, far removed from the stench of the battlefield. Yet,
The most violent warlords of the region would bow their heads in his presence, terrified not of his physical strength, but of his moral weight. Osman understood that to rule these people, he could not just be their commander. He had to be their father. And to be their father, he needed the blessing of Edebali. The relationship between the rough warlord and the serene mystic became the cornerstone of the Ottoman state. It was a union of sword and scripture. Osman spent hours sitting at the sheikh's feet, listening, learning to tame the wolf inside him. He was learning that a state cannot be governed by the same rage that conquers a fortress. History has preserved the words that Edebali spoke to Osman. They are not merely advice. They are the constitution of the Ottoman mindset. Listen to the burden being placed on the shoulders of a young man. "Oh, my son, now you are Bey. From now on, wrath is for us. For you, calmness. For us to take offense. For you to forgive. For us to accuse. For you to endure. From now on, it is for us to make mistakes. For you to correct them." Let those words sink in. In a world defined by ego and violence, Edebali was teaching Osman the hardest lesson of all. The ruler must suffer, so the people do not have to. He was stripping away the privilege of anger. A bandit leader can fly into a rage and execute a subordinate for a minor failure. A sultan cannot. A sultan must be a stone that breaks the waves, not the wind that whips them up. This advice transformed Osman. It polished the rough edges of the nomad and revealed the statesman underneath. But Edebali gave Osman more than just wisdom. He gave him his daughter. The marriage between Osman and Bala Hatun, or Malhun Hatun in some chronicles, was the physical sealing of this alliance. It was a masterstroke. By marrying the daughter of the most respected religious leader in the region, Osman instantly absorbed the loyalty of the Ahi brotherhoods. He was no longer just a tribal chief. He was now the son-in-law of the faith. This consolidated his power base in a way that no military victory ever could. The Ahis, with their networks of spies, merchants, and craftsmen, became the infrastructure of his new state. The stage was now set. Osman had the warriors, Ghazis. He had the spiritual backing, Ahis. He had the geography, the frontier. All he needed now was a myth. A story so powerful that it would convince his followers that their conquest was not just probable, but inevitable. And that story would come to him, not on the battlefield, but in his sleep. The stage was set, the players were positioned, but the play could not begin without a script. And that script was written not with ink, but with the vapor of the subconscious. We arrive now at the moment that defines the Ottoman soul. It is the story every Turkish child learns in school, the foundational myth that justified 6 centuries of rule. But here, in the dark, we will strip away the textbook polish and walk into the dream itself. The year is uncertain, perhaps late in the 1280s. Osman is sleeping in the guest quarters of Sheikh Edebali's lodge. The room is sparse, smelling of dried herbs and the faint acrid smoke of a candle that has just guttered out. Osman is agitated. His mind is a whirlpool of ambition and inadequacy. He is lying on a simple wool mat, staring into the darkness, until exhaustion finally drags him under. And then, the vision begins. In the dream, he sees a moon. It is not in the sky. It is rising from the chest of Sheikh Edebali, who is sleeping in the next room. The moon is full, blindingly bright, a glowing orb of pure spiritual authority. It ascends slowly, hovering in the void. Before it begins to descend, it sinks,
heavy and purposeful, until it enters Osman's own chest. The moment it disappears inside him, a sensation of terrible pressure expands in his ribcage. It is not pain. It is growth. From his navel, a tree begins to sprout. It is a great plane tree, a chinar, the symbol of endurance and majesty. But this is no ordinary sapling. It grows with terrifying speed. Its bark is thick and gnarled, like the skin of an ancient elephant. Its branches shoot upwards, piercing the clouds, spreading out until they cast a shadow over the entire horizon. Under the shade of this colossal tree, Osman sees the world. But he does not just see it, he owns it. He sees 4 great mountain ranges: the Taurus, the Caucasus, the Atlas, and the Balkans. They are the pillars of his canopy. From the roots of the tree, 4 mighty rivers burst forth: the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Nile, and the Danube. Note the geography carefully. These are not random names. They represent the heartlands of the ancient world. The tree is drinking from the veins of history. The imagery shifts. It becomes sharper, more menacing. The leaves of the tree are not fluttering in the breeze. They are elongated. They are sharp. They turn into scimitars, pointing toward the major cities of the infidels. The wind blows, and the leaves clash together with the sound of 1,000 armies marching. Clang, clang, clang. The sound of destiny is metallic. And then, through a gap in the leaves, Osman sees a single object. Situated at the junction of 2 seas and 2 continents, sparkling like a diamond set between 2 sapphires and 2 emeralds. It is a ring. The ring of universal sovereignty. It is the city of Constantinople. In the dream, the city is not a fortress to be feared. It is a piece of jewelry waiting to be worn. Osman reaches out his hand. His fingers brush the cold gold of the ring. He can feel the pulse of the world beating inside it. He stretches further, his fingertips grazing the stone, desperate to claim it. He wakes up. He is sweating. The silence of the lodge is deafening. The moon and the tree are gone, but the weight in his chest remains. He rushes to Sheikh Edebali and recounts the vision. The old mystic listens, his face unreadable in the morning light. Then he smiles. It is the smile of a man who has seen the future and made his peace with it. "Oh, my son Osman," Edebali says, his voice cutting through the morning chill. "Congratulations. God the Almighty has granted sovereignty to you and your lineage. My daughter will be your wife, and the whole world will be under the protection of your children." This was the Osman's dream meaning, a divine land deed. It changed everything. Before this night, Osman was a warlord fighting for survival. After this night, he was a monarch fighting for destiny. The dream provided the psychological armor his warriors needed. When they burned a village, they were not destroying. They were pruning the garden of God. When they conquered a city, they were merely fulfilling a prophecy written in the stars. The dream legitimized the blood. It turned a gruesome business of empire building into a holy liturgy. The scimitars were no longer just steel. They were the leaves of the great plane tree, and they were hungry. The dream provided the divine license, but it did not provide the daily bread. To feed the growing pack of wolves gathering at his tent flaps, Osman needed a system. He needed an economic engine that ran on something other than faith. And that engine was the Razzia. In the West, they called it a raid, but a Razzia was not a chaotic brawl. It was a calculated industrial process of extraction. It was the primary industry of the early Ottoman state. The raw material was the Byzantine countryside, and the finished product was movable wealth. Imagine the dawn breaking over the Sakarya River. You do not hear the heavy stomp of infantry boots. You hear the thundering, erratic rhythm of light cavalry. These are the Akunja, the raiders. They are the terror of the frontier. Unlike the European knights encumbered by 60 pounds of plate armor, the Akunja wear simple leather or chainmail vests. They ride fast mares, not heavy war horses. They are fluid. They are fast. They are lethal. Their tactic is not to crash into the enemy, but to flow around them like water. They strike the undefended villages at harvest time. Why harvest time? Because that is when the value is highest. They take the grain, the cattle, and the sheep. But the most valuable commodity is not four-legged, it is two-legged. We must look unflinchingly at the mechanics of this harvest. When the Akunja descended on a village, the men of fighting age were often cut down where they stood. They were liabilities. The real prizes were the women and children. This was not collateral damage. This was the objective. A young, healthy Greek boy could be sold in the markets of Damascus for a price that would feed a Ghazi's family for a year. A skilled artisan could be ransomed back to his family in Constantinople for a bag of silver. There is a cold, bureaucratic efficiency to the violence. Once the screaming stops, the sorting begins. The captives are roped together by the neck, forming a long, stumbling column known as the silsile. They are inspected like livestock. Teeth are checked, muscles are squeezed. The old and the sick are often left behind or discarded, considered dead weight that would slow down the retreat. The ganima, the booty, is then divided.
1/5 goes to Osman, the penchik tax, establishing his treasury. The rest belongs to the warriors. This system created a terrifying feedback loop. The more they raided, the richer they became. The richer they became, the more weapons and horses they could buy. The more weapons they had, the deeper they could raid. It was a perpetual motion machine of misery. Osman didn't need to tax his own people because he was effectively taxing the Byzantine population, taking their labor, their wealth, and their future. To the modern observer, this is a war crime. To the early Ottoman state, it was simply the logistics of survival. The greatness of the empire was being funded by the auction blocks of the slave trade. But raiding villages is one thing, taking a city is another. And here, Osman faced a technological wall, quite literally. The Kayi tribe were nomads. They were masters of the open field, lethal in a skirmish. But they were utterly baffled by stone engineering. They had no trebuchets to hurl boulders. They had no mangonels. They did not even have proper scaling ladders. When they stood before the high walls of major Byzantine cities like Nicaea or Prusa, they were like wolves barking at a mountain. The stone did not care about their arrows. The stone did not fear their swords. So, Osman changed the game. If he could not break the walls, he would simply wait for the people behind them to die. This was the birth of the Ottoman strategy of Kushatma, the blockade. It was not a battle. It was a slow, agonizing asphyxiation. Osman realized that a city is like a living organism. It needs to eat. It needs to drink. If you cut the throat, the body dies. He stopped trying to storm the gates and instead began to build his own structures. He constructed small, annoying forts called havale, overlooking the main roads leading into the cities. These were not grand castles. They were watchtowers, predator blinds, manned by his most patient archers.
Their orders were simple. Nothing goes in, nothing comes out. Imagine the psychological terror of this. Inside the city of Prusa, the granaries are slowly emptying. The price of wheat doubles, then triples, then becomes irrelevant because there is no wheat left to buy. The citizens look out from the ramparts, their stomachs twisting with hunger. And what do they see? They see the smoke of Osman's campfires. And here is where the cruelty becomes an art form. The wind in Bithynia often blows from the plains up toward the citadel. Osman's cooks would roast whole lambs on spits in the open air. They would bake fresh flatbread on hot stones. They made sure the smell, the rich, heavy scent of dripping fat and charred meat, drifted on the breeze, wafting over the walls and into the nostrils of the starving defenders. It was a torture worse than any physical blow. It drove men mad. It turned the population against the Tekfur. Why should the governor eat while the children chew on boiled leather? This siege did not last for weeks. It lasted for years. 10 years, sometimes more. It was a test of wills. Osman was in no hurry. He had the countryside. He had the food. He simply sat there, watching the seasons change, watching the Tekfur grow thinner and thinner in his high tower. This was not the glorious combat of the romances. There were no duels at dawn. There was only the silent, grinding reality of starvation. Osman turned time into a weapon. He proved that you don't need to be stronger than your enemy to defeat him. You just need to be more patient. You just need to be willing to watch him slowly wither away until he crawls out to you, begging for a piece of bread. And eventually, they always crawled out. One by one, the great cities began to suffocate. The gates that could not be broken by rams were opened by despair. When the Byzantines finally surrendered, they did not find a monster waiting for them. They found Osman, holding out a loaf of bread in one hand and a tax ledger in the other. Eat, he seemed to say, and then serve. The slow strangulation of the cities was effective, but it had a consequence Osman could not ignore. It woke the sleeping giant. For years, Constantinople had treated him as a nuisance, a local pest control problem. But as the smoke of the burning villages drew closer to the imperial capital, the emperor, Andronikos II, could no longer pretend that Osman did not exist. He realized that if he did not swat this fly now, it would soon be eating from his plate. So, in the summer of 1302, the order was given. The imperial army was mobilized. This was the moment of truth. Until now, Osman had fought local garrisons and tired militia. He had never faced the full, disciplined might of a Roman field army. Leading them was George Musalon, a commander of the high nobility, marching at the head of 2,000 professional soldiers. They were a mix of heavy Byzantine cavalry, clad in lamellar armor that gleamed like fish scales, and Alan mercenaries, fierce fighters from the Caucasus. They marched out to a plain near Nicomedia called Bapheus. On July 27, 1302, the two worlds collided. If you had stood on the ridge that day, you would have seen a study in contrasts. On one side, the rigid, geometric formations of the Byzantines, shield walls locked tight, spears bristling like a hedge of steel. On the other side, chaos. Or so it seemed. Osman's forces were a swarm. They were lighter, faster, and they did not stand still. They were mounted archers, riding small, wiry steppe ponies that could turn on a dime. The battle did not begin with a charge. It began with a sound that George Pachymeres, the Byzantine historian who chronicled this disaster, would never forget. It was the sound of the wind, but sharper. It was the hissing of thousands of arrows launched in high arcs, raining down on the heavy infantry. The composite bows of the Turks were singing. The Byzantine heavy cavalry tried to close the distance. They spurred their massive war horses forward, expecting to crush the nomads under sheer weight of iron. But they were punching smoke. As they charged, the Turks simply melted away, retreating while turning back in their saddles to fire, the famous Parthian shot. The Byzantines found themselves chasing shadows, their horses blowing hard in the summer heat, their armor turning into ovens. Then, the trap snapped shut. As the Byzantine formation lost its cohesion, stretched thin by the pursuit, Osman gave the signal. The retreating nomads suddenly wheeled around. The swarm collapsed inward. It was not a battle line anymore. It was a meat grinder. The light cavalry slashed at the unprotected legs of the horses, bringing the armored knights crashing into the dust. Once on the ground, the heavy armor that was supposed to protect the Romans became their coffin. They could not rise. They were swarmed by Ghazi warriors, wielding maces and axes, tools designed to crack shells. George Muzalan, seeing the slaughter, panicked. The discipline of the imperial army evaporated. It became a rout. The professional soldiers of Rome broke and ran, scrambling for the safety of the nearby city of Nicomedia. Osman did not just defeat them, he humiliated them. He chased the remnants of the emperor's army right up to the city gates, pinning them inside. The message was written in the blood soaking the plain of Bapheus. The age of the Romans was over. The age of the Ottomans had begun. This moment, right here, was the psychological turning point of the entire saga. Before Bapheus, the Turks feared the Romans. There was a lingering cultural inferiority complex. The Byzantines were the heirs of Caesar. They were the builders of the Hagia Sophia. They were the masters of the world. But as Osman's men looked down at the broken bodies of the imperial guards, that fear evaporated. They realized a simple, primal truth. The Romans bleed just like us. Their gold does not stop arrows. Their history does not stop axes. Bapheus was not just a military victory. It was the death of an illusion. The aura of invincibility that had protected Constantinople for centuries was shattered on that field. Osman rode through the lines of his cheering men, but he did not smile. He knew what this victory meant. It was a crossing of the Rubicon. By destroying an imperial field army, he had painted a target on his back that would never be erased. He was no longer a border nuisance. He was now a rival monarch. The news of this disaster would travel fast. It would reach the emperor in Constantinople, causing panic in the marble halls of the palace. It would reach the Pope in Rome. It would reach the Khan in Persia. The name Osman was being written into the diplomatic ledgers of the world, not in ink, but in the blood of George Muzalan's legions. But amidst the triumph, there was a solemnity to the scene. The Ghazis were busy collecting the ghanima, piles of swords, helmets, and most importantly, horses. The Byzantine war horses were magnificent beasts, far larger than the steppe ponies. Taking them was a transfer of power. The tools of the oppressor were now in the hands of the oppressed. Yet, Osman halted his horse on a rise overlooking the Sea of Marmara. He looked west. He could almost smell the salt air of the Aegean. He realized that the raiding days were ending. You do not raid an empire you have just defeated. You replace it. The destruction of the Byzantine army meant that the countryside was now defenseless. The cities were isolated islands in a Turkish sea. The time for running was over. The time for ruling had begun. The sword had done its work. The enemy was broken. But Osman knew that a kingdom cannot be built on blood alone. Blood washes away with the next rain. To build something permanent, something that would outlast the rot of the flesh, he needed a different kind of metal. He needed silver. We are now in the quiet of a craftsman's workshop, far from the screams of Bapheus. The air smells of charcoal and hot metal. A hammer rises and falls. Clink, clink, clink. With every strike, a new reality is being forged. The smith is not making a weapon. He is making a coin. It is small, roughly the size of a fingernail. It is not perfectly round. Its edges are jagged, clipped by shears. But it carries a weight far heavier than any shield. On the face of this silver token, known as the akçe, the smith does not carve the face of the Seljuk Sultan. He does not carve the name of the Mongol Khan. For the first time in history, he carves a new name, Osman bin Ertuğrul. And beneath it, a prayer that is also a command. May his victory be glorious. This was the true declaration of independence. In the medieval Islamic world, there were two supreme signs of sovereignty, the khutbah and the shikke. The khutbah was the Friday sermon. To have your name read aloud in the mosques meant you were the master of the faithful. The shikke was the minting of coins. To have your name on the money meant you were the master of the economy. By doing this, Osman was committing high treason against his Seljuk overlords. He was looking at the dying sultanate and saying, "You are a ghost. I am the living." Hold that tiny, imperfect silver coin in your mind. It is the seed of an empire. It represents the transition from a beylik, a tribal chiefdom, to a devlet, a state. Before this coin, Osman was a man you paid protection money to. After this coin, he was a man you paid taxes to. It seems like a small distinction, but it is the difference between a bandit and a king. The bandit takes what he wants and leaves. The king takes what he wants and stays. He builds roads. He builds bridges. He builds courts. He weaves his power into the very fabric of daily life, so that you cannot buy a loaf of bread without touching his name. This was the genius of Osman. He understood that conquest is not just about taking land. It is about taking ownership of the mind. When a peasant in Bithynia went to the market and traded a Byzantine copper for an Ottoman silver, he was acknowledging a change in the universe. The face of Christ was being replaced by the name of Osman. The cross was yielding to the calligraphy. It was a subtle, silent revolution that happened in the pockets of the common people long after the armies had gone home. The empire was no longer just a dream in a tent. It was now hard currency, circulating from hand to hand, binding every soul in the region to the fate of the House of Osman. We must now pause the narrative and put on our white gloves. We need to step back from the heat of the campfire and the glory of the silver coin to examine the cold, hard evidence. Because here, in the forensic lab of history, there is a discrepancy. A gap in the timeline that has frustrated scholars for centuries. We call it the Ottoman black hole. Open the history books, and they will tell you that the empire was founded in 1299. It is the date etched onto monuments, printed in textbooks, and celebrated in anniversaries. But if you look for the paper trail from that year, you will find nothing. No Declaration of Independence signed in ink. No royal charter. The early Ottomans were illiterate nomads. They did not write history. They wrote it. They were too busy surviving to keep a diary. So where does the number 1299 come from? It is a calculation, a backward deduction made by later chroniclers, trying to fit Osman's life into a neat, divine calendar. They tied it to the collapse of the Seljuks, creating a poetic transfer of power. 1299 is the romantic date. It is the date of the legend. But in the murky world of dark history, we do not care about romance. We care about proof. And the Sherlock Holmes of Ottoman history, the great Professor Halil İnalcık, pointed his magnifying glass at a different year. 1302. Why 1302? Because of the Battle of Bapheus. İnalcık argued that a state does not exist simply because a man says it does. A state exists only when its enemies recognize it. In 1299, Osman was just a local troublemaker. But in 1302, by defeating the imperial army of Byzantium, he forced the world to look at him. That battle was the moment the Beylik became a political reality on the international stage. 1299 is when Osman thought he was a king. 1302 is when the emperor knew he was a king. Does this distinction matter? Yes, because it changes the story from a fairy tale of destined greatness to a gritty reality of earned power. It tells us that the empire was not a gift from God, delivered in a dream. It was a status seized by force of arms in the mud of Bapheus. Yet, whether the date is 1299 or 1302, the result was the same. A machine had been switched on that could not be turned off. Osman had created a system that demanded constant expansion. The Ghazi economy relied on plunder. To keep his army happy, he had to keep conquering. To keep conquering, he needed more army. It was a predatory cycle that would eventually consume the Middle East, North Africa, and Eastern Europe. The small silver coin we saw earlier was just the first down payment on a debt of blood that would take 600 years to pay off. The debt was paid in installments, generation after generation. When we look at the legacy of Osman I, we must look beyond the maps. Maps are sterile. They show lines moving across paper. They do not show the cost of moving those lines. The system Osman built, the combination of religious zeal, Razzia, and economic predation, ghanima, was brilliant. But it was also a trap. It created a state that was addicted to war. Think of the Ottoman Empire not as a static kingdom, but as a shark. It had to keep moving, keep devouring, or it would drown. The warriors who flocked to Osman's banner were not paid a salary from a central treasury. They were paid in the loot of the next conquest. If the conquest stopped, the pay stopped. If the pay stopped, the loyalty evaporated. This meant that peace was not an option. Peace was a death sentence for the state. This simple, brutal economic reality would drive the Ottomans to hammer at the gates of Vienna centuries later. They were not just marching for glory. They were marching because the machine Osman built could not be turned off. This legacy of blood infected the very DNA of the dynasty. Osman's rise proved that in this hard land, legitimacy did not come from bloodlines or ancient titles. It came from competence. It came from being the strongest wolf in the pack. This created a ruthless meritocracy that would haunt his descendants. Later, this would evolve into the law of fratricide, where a new sultan was legally required to strangle all his brothers to prevent civil war. That law was not written by Osman, but the ink was mixed here, in the mud of Bithynia. He taught his people that power is not inherited, it is seized. He taught them that the only sin is weakness. And what of the culture? The fusion of the wandering Turk and the settled Byzantine created something unique. We often think of conquest as one side wiping out the other. But Osman did something more subtle. He absorbed. As he took the Byzantine forts, he didn't just kill the Greeks. He married them. He converted them. Many of his greatest generals were former Christian commanders who saw the wind changing and adjusted their sails. The Ottoman bloodline itself became a mixture. The Turkish Empire was built by men with Greek mothers, Serbian wives, and Albanian viziers. It was a melting pot, but the fire beneath the pot was fueled by the timber of destroyed cities. So, when we look back at the founder, we see a complex shadow. He was a man who could be incredibly generous to his followers, giving away his last spoon, yet utterly ruthless to his enemies, starving them into submission. He was a builder of mosques and a destroyer of churches. He was a simple nomad who dreamed of a world empire. He left behind no great stone palaces. He left behind a methodology, a blueprint for domination that was so effective, so durable, that it would outlive him by 600 years. He didn't just leave a kingdom to his son Orhan. He left him a loaded weapon and pointed it at the heart of Europe. We have spoken of the victor. We have spoken of the coins, the swords, and the dreams of empire. But a story is not complete until we speak of the ghosts. In the shadow of the great plane tree, the grass does not grow, and neither does memory. For every name carved into the marble of history, there are 10,000 names written on water, vanishing the moment the stone sinks. Who were they? They were the villagers of the Sakarya Valley who woke up one morning to find that their world had ended. They were the farmers who had tilled the same olive groves for 20 generations, speaking Greek, praying to Christ, and paying taxes to an emperor who was nothing more than a face on a coin. When the Akunta rider swept through, these people did not vanish into thin air. They vanished into the margins. Imagine the refugee columns trudging west toward Nicomedia. It is a river of misery. Carts with broken wheels, piled high with useless heirlooms, a grandmother's loom, a copper pot, a holy icon with the paint chipping off. They are fleeing the Pax Ottomana. To them, Osman was not a visionary statesman. He was the apocalypse. He was the reason they were sleeping in ditches and eating boiled grass. When they finally reached the safety of the city walls, they were not welcomed as brothers. They were reviled as mouths to feed. They died of typhus in the crowded streets of the very empire they had fled to protect. Their graves are unmarked. Their stories are untold. And what of the others? The rival Turks. We often forget that Osman did not just fight Christians. He fought his own kin. There were other beys, other tribal leaders, who looked at the crumbling Seljuk state and saw their own chance for glory. Men like the lords of Germian, or the chieftains of the Kandarids. They were just as brave, just as ambitious, perhaps even more noble. But they lacked Osman's ruthless geographic advantage. They were boxed in, and so history devoured them. Today, you might find a broken tombstone in a weed-choked cemetery in central Anatolia, bearing the name of a forgotten bey. He probably had dreams, too. He probably had a wife who loved him, and warriors who would die for him. But he lost. And in the brutal calculus of the steppe, losing means erasure. His tribe was absorbed. His banner was burned. His descendants grew up speaking the dialect of the Ottomans, forgetting that their grandfathers once fought to destroy them. This is the ultimate violence of empire. It doesn't just kill your body. It colonizes your memory. It forces your grandchildren to cheer for the men who slaughtered you. Listen closely to the wind blowing through the ruins of Bithynia. You will not hear the clash of swords anymore. You will hear the silence. It is a heavy, suffocating silence. It is the sound of thousands of unique cultures, dialects, and local traditions being ground down into the uniform dust of a single state. The Ottoman Empire was a magnificent tapestry, yes. But we must never forget that the threads were dyed with the blood of the people it consumed. We celebrate the weaver, but we ignore the cost of the wool. All storms must eventually run out of rain, and so we come to the end of the man who started the gale. The year is 1324, or perhaps 1326. The dates, as always in this era, are shrouded in fog. But the scene is clear. Osman is dying. He is not dying on a battlefield, surrounded by the glory of combat. He is dying in a bed, his body betraying him. The irony of history is cruel. The man who spent his life in the saddle, riding across the steppes, is now crippled by gout, the disease of kings. His legs, which once gripped the flanks of war horses, are swollen and useless. He is an old wolf, his teeth worn down, lying in his tent in Sot, listening to the world continue without him. But his eyes are fixed on one thing. Even on his deathbed, he is still besieging. He is looking toward the city of Prusa, Bursa. For years, he has watched it from a distance, like a lover watching a forbidden house. It is the Silver City, the gleaming prize that has eluded him. He knows he will not walk through its gates. That triumph belongs to his son, Orhan. And this is the final lesson of Osman. A true founder plants trees under whose shade he does not expect to sit. Orhan stands by the bedside. He is not a boy anymore. He is a warrior, hardened by the same winds that carved his father. The transfer of power is quiet. There is no pomp, no coronation with golden crowns. Osman hands him the sword, the same curved blade that cut the first path through the frontier. He gives him his final testament, the Nasihatnameh. It is not a manual on how to conquer. It is a manual on how to remain human while doing it. "Do not be proud of your soldiers," he whispers, his voice rasping like dry leaves. "Do not be deceived by your wealth. Justice is the foundation of the state." And then the breath leaves him. The chest that held the great plane tree stops moving. The founder is dead. Now the inventory begins. The scribes come to record the inheritance of the Sultan. This is the moment where the myth usually collapses, where the secret hoards of gold are revealed. But when they open Osman's personal chests, they stop. They look at each other in confusion. There is no gold. There is no silver. There are no jewels. What do they find? Let us read the list together. 1 salt shaker. 1 wooden box for spoons. A few pairs of boots. A caftan made of simple denizli cloth. A few horses, and a yoke for oxen. That is it. That is the net worth of the man who founded a superpower. He did not die a rich man. He died empty. He had poured everything he had, his wealth, his energy, his blood, into the soil of the state. He left his son an empire, but he did not leave him a single coin to spend on vanity. This poverty was his final seal of legitimacy. It proved that he was not a warlord looting for himself. He was a servant of a cause larger than his own hunger. They carried his body to Bursa, which finally fell to Orhan shortly after. They buried him in a converted Byzantine chapel, now known as the Gümüşlü Kumbet, the Silver Dome. He rests there today, lying in the center of the city he coveted but never ruled. The dome above him is silent, but outside, the empire he birthed would scream and roar for another 6 centuries, shaking the pillars of the world. If you travel to Bursa today, You will find a bustling, modern metropolis. You will hear the honking of taxi horns and the chatter of tourists buying silk scarves in the Grand Bazaar. They stand in line to visit the Green Tomb, taking selfies in front of the tilework, marveling at the geometric beauty of the architecture. They see the glory. They see the finished product. But if you strip away the asphalt and the concrete, if you silence the noise of the 21st century and put your ear to the damp earth, you might still hear it. The faint, rhythmic thumping of a drum. The scuff of a worn-out boot on stone. The snap of a bowstring. The history of the Ottoman Empire is not found in the pristine museums or the guided tours. It is found in the dirt. It is found in the unrecorded graves of thousands who were ground into dust to make the mortar for those magnificent walls. The empire was not a miracle. It was a machine fueled by the dark statistic we spoke of, the 400 tents that became 1,000,000 swords. Here at BBM Historical Review, we do not polish the statues. We look for the cracks. We do not just read the royal decrees. We read the silence between the lines. Because history is not what the victors tell you it is. History is what they are trying to hide. Osman I started with a dream and a sword. He left behind a legacy that would burn down the old world to build a new one. But the fire he lit is not out. It still smolders in the fault lines of our world today. You have heard the verdict. You have seen the evidence. Now, the judgment is yours. Look at the place where others turn away. Listen to the sound of the things that are not supposed to be heard. I am your guide into the dark, and we have only just begun to dig. Osman planted the tree, but trees need water, and the tree of the Ottomans drinks only one liquid. Next time, we move from the father to the son. We move from the raiding party to the standing army. We will witness the birth of the most feared military unit in history, the Janissaries. We will see how Christian children were taken, broken, and remade into the fanatical guardians of Islam. Osman built the state, but it was his descendants who would turn it into a weapon that would shatter the walls of Constantinople. The wolf has entered the fold, and the slaughter has only just begun.